evening, everybody. Let's go ahead and turn our Bibles to Exodus chapter 27. Exodus 27. Imagine, if you would, that your first day of class, you get the textbook. The textbook for the class is divided into chapters. And in those chapters, you notice there is one chapter. That one chapter constitutes 1/4 of the textbook. Now, what might that tell you about the chapter? If volume is any indication, then the volume of material would indicate that the subject matter is pretty important. If I hope to be successful in that class, it would probably be wise of me to invest some effort into that section of the text. That has much to do with where we're at in the book of Exodus. In the book of Exodus, we're in a section that has a couple of transition points in it, but for the most part is several chapters devoted to the tabernacle, the residence for God among the people as they're traveling around Sinai and will travel into the wilderness with. It's worth noting, the book of Exodus, instructions about the tabernacle, its furnishings, its design, and its construction constitute almost 1/4 of the book of Exodus. Almost exactly. Now that suggests to me this is not boring reading. Sometimes I think we're guilty of that. I know I am. And when you're reading from Scripture, you get into that section where you start reading about the description of the tabernacle and how it's arranged and all of the different details of the furnishings and things. Well, this doesn't have anything to do with me, and we just bypass it. We read it real quickly and perhaps hardly at all, and well, I think we do that to our shame. Because as we observed last week in Hebrews 8 verse 5, we understand that the things of the tabernacle were shadows and examples of heavenly things. Meaning, there is a good reason that God spent so much energy and time and effort to communicate to us the precise details of the tabernacle. And in part, that has much to do with what the tabernacle is a representation of, and that is heaven. It is the heavenly economy. It is the realm in which God dwells permanently. There's heavenly information, and there's large sections, as you know, in the book of Hebrews, devoted to that subject alone. We could probably, and I'm not exaggerating, we could spend a year just doing symbolism studies from the book of Exodus, all having to do with Jesus or the salvation that He offers us. Very much of that is interwoven into the tabernacle instructions. So it's an exciting place for us to study, and you see there the image I showed you last week, which is an artist's representation of what the tabernacle might have looked like. You can take that for what it's worth, but I do think it's helpful in terms of perspective, if nothing else. Let's bow together as we begin our study. Dear God, thank you for this day and for the blessings that you've provided to us. Thank you for the safety you've given us to be here. Thank you for the occasion to study your word. We're thankful for the power of your word, for its ability to strengthen and equip us. And we pray that we will, with all of our energy, commit our lives to learning your word and living according to its principles. We're thankful for this time that we can share and pray that you'll bless us richly. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Exodus chapter 27 is where we will begin. And we're kind of midstream. We're still talking about the residence for God, the design of the tabernacle. We get to around chapter 38, you get to see the construction of this, the fulfillment. But But let's take pause as we go through 3 different descriptions in chapter 27 to see what we can learn about heavenly features of the tabernacle. Heavenly features of the tabernacle. The first has to do with this altar. You shall make, verse 1, an altar of acacia wood. Its dimensions are given. Verse 2, you shall make its horns on its 4 corners. Its horns shall be one piece, and you shall overlay it with bronze. Now, no matter what you take away from the description of the altar, here's what I think we need to understand. It was an altar upon which sacrifice occurred, and it was a prominent feature of the tabernacle. It was you would not venture into the courtyard or perhaps outside of it and see that opening, the door, the gate area open, and you wouldn't be able to bypass it. It was an impressive instrument. And there it was. In a place of prominence, right there in the courtyard, a place upon which they would offer sacrifice. Seems to me that there is a heavenly feature in mind here. The heavenly feature, if the tabernacle represents heaven itself, which I believe it clearly does, then within the heavenly economy, the heavenly environment, there is a prominence given to sacrifice. There is a prominent sacrifice. Sacrifice has something to do with acquisition, entrance into the presence of God. And instantly, you should have about a dozen New Testament passages circulating through your mind, all of which talk about Jesus and His work for us and what He enables us to receive through His work. What do we have here? We have an exclusive location for sacrifice. You read the rest of the Pentateuch and you're going to learn some interesting things. Number 1, you were prohibited by the law of Moses from offering a sacrifice for your sin anywhere else but this altar. And in fact, if you did it, you were cut off from the people. It is an exclusive, it is a solitary and a single place that atoning sacrifice can be made. No place else. It is the prominent element of the tabernacle. We read its descriptions. It's overlaid with bronze, just like all of the outdoor furnishings of the tabernacle, basically. Its utensils, it had a grate, which would be the surface that would be somewhat like a grill, probably. A network underneath, probably for the fuel. It had 4 rings of bronze on each side through which they inserted poles to carry it with. It was hollow. It was made to be transported easily and lightly. But the end of verse 8, he says, as it was shown you on the mountain. And here we are again. The details that were given in words are very brief. Moses was given a blueprint, it would appear, in his discussion with God when the original pattern was given. What we really read is an abbreviated version of what these things look like. But the idea, the pattern still in place. You make it according to the pattern that I showed you. The tabernacle, there was a prominent sacrifice. How about this one? The courtyard. Somebody like to read for us. Read verse 9 and 10, please. Exodus 27, 9 and 10.
You shall also make the court of the tabernacle. For the south side there shall be beams for the court made of fine wood and linen, 100 cubits long on one side. And its 20 pillars and their 20 sockets shall be bronze. The hooks of the pillars and their bands shall be silver.
All right, so it's a tent. Fabric walls. Fabric walls. Now, as we go down through the rest of that description, you get the idea. It was a rectangle, basically. The 2 outside longer edges are parallel and equal. The back is closed off. The front has an equal distance, but it's open. There's an opening, and there's some details about that. The exact number of pillars, the posts, the foundation upon which the posts sit, the top, the number, the distance. It's all laid out. It's all given by pattern. It's all given by requirement. And at no point, as we talked last week, were the humans who were involved in the fulfillment of this pattern ever given the ability to say, but maybe if you think that's a little bit better, if you think it would be better to have 4 or 5 additional ones or take 2 or 3 away or use a different metal, you do your own thing. Never is that latitude given to humanity. It never has been, nor shall it ever be. But the gate's a little bit different. It's a little different color we read about. We read about its bands and its hooks, again, its sockets, its posts, and all of the things, and all of the utensils of the tabernacle. All of the pegs that are going to hold up those posts that by cord, it would appear. All of them should be of bronze. We read all these descriptions. What does any of this mean? The courtyard talks about a preeminent place. The presence of God is associated with a preeminent place. A place that gives access to Him, but He's distant from. Remember, He's in the most holy place inside the tabernacle. There's a holy place outside of that, and then you have the courtyard. The courtyard is an open space, but it isn't open to just anybody. Not just anybody can come in here. This is a preeminent place. This is a place that you come, well, we would kind of colloquialize this by saying you come by invitation only. Well, what was the invitation to enter that courtyard? Well, you had to be a child of God. Now, to do certain things within that courtyard, you had to be of a certain tribe, right? But if you were a Gentile and you made your way into the courtyard, what was the consequence of that? You're going to die. You're not prohibited to enter this if you're not a child of God, under no circumstances. In fact, when they will lay out the encampments of the tribes around the tabernacle, who is around it? Do we remember? Who's around it? Encircling it, as it were, on all 4 sides. The Levites. Why? To protect it from intrusion of outsiders and to protect outsiders from entering that holy place unauthorized. This is a preeminent place. That's a heavenly principle. Not just anybody is able to get into proximity with God. It is an exclusive kind of place. There is a restrictive fellowship with God. And there always has been. A separation of the place where worshipers could come. Now, we could spend some time, and I contemplated it, but that courtyard, if you do the math on it, was just a little over 11,000 square feet. That's huge. That's accommodating of a huge number of people. And you can draw from that many important lessons, I believe, about the value of God's people in corporate assembly of worship and sacrifice. But that's a preeminent place. That courtyard draws our attention. It grabs us. And it reminds us, not just anyone can go in there, because that's just not any place. That is the courtyard of the tabernacle. That's where God dwells. That makes it different. It makes it hugely different. Now let's notice one more. Verse 20, you shall command the children of Israel that they bring pure oil of pressed olives for the light. Now we read about the lamp post, or the lamp last week. To cause the lamp to burn continually. Now we understand as we read down through that Aaron and his sons are responsible for tending it from morning till evening. In other words, it didn't go out all night long. And it couldn't. That was their job. Their job was to make sure that there was sufficient pure oil, pressed by hand, strained by cloth or some substance like that would appear, so that it was the purest form, no impurities in it. It burned the brightest, and it would burn long because they would have enough of it on supply from the willing sacrifice of the people. Now, what do we learn about this? What's the heavenly principle that we learn from a lamp, a candlelight? Now, remember, we talked about how enormously more bright the light source for the tabernacle was compared to anything else of the common people. And I threw out kind of in jest, but not really. It would be, the tabernacle was kind of like the Strip, when the Las Vegas lights kind of thing. It was that much vibrant in comparison to what you would have found in a tent that somebody was dwelling in. It would have been huge. It would have lit up everywhere. But why would it be lit up? And why would it be lit up at night? And why would it be lit all hours of the night? What does it teach us? About the permanent presence of God. You see, the Israelites were not to come to the conclusion that God needed to sleep. He didn't go to sleep in his house. He didn't slumber for the next day's labor. The light was continually burning in his house. Why? To remind them he was ever active, always present, right there among them, never to depart. Now I want us to notice this one little phrase before we move into chapter 28. It's the end of verse 21. Aaron and his sons shall tend it from evening till morning. And notice this phrase, before the Lord. Now remember that the candle was outside the most holy place. It was in the holy place area of the tabernacle. But it was before the Lord. Now that phrase, the reason I point that phrase out is we're going to see it at least 3 other times. It becomes kind of a jumping off point, a transition point that we're going to try to use to make some other points about heaven, particularly the priesthood associated with heaven. Randy, go ahead.
I've got an itchy thought here, and it's my number one list. It's sort of off the subject, but yeah, it's connected. When Nadab and Abihu, they offered strange fire on this altar. What made that fire strange? Was it because they were not allowed to do that, only Aaron could, or did that fire come from another source?
All right, it's a good question, and it's pertinent because we're going to read about those 2 individuals. We're going to read about Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, who in Leviticus 10 are executed divinely because of authoring strange fire, which means unauthorized fire. Now, the exact details of that we aren't given, other than it was fire that was not authorized, which puts us exactly into this same category of thought. God's worship, service of God is always legislated by what he says and what he commands. And there is, at least to my knowledge, and I've tried to find this, there is to my knowledge no passage of Scripture says this is where you get the fire other than the priest knew where and how to assemble it. That would be my best shot at that. But it has very much to do.
But they were authorized to do it.
They were authorized to do it. They were priests. They would have been authorized to offer sacrifices on the altar. It was the nature of the fire. It was something about the fire it would seem to be. Yes.
It says they offered strange fire.
Right.
It was not from the source that they were supposed to get it from.
Right. Not from the source authorized by God. Very good. Yes.
Was that source with the candlestick? They had a pit of fire going all the time.
Yep. Yeah. They just did it the wrong source. Dennis is going to do Leviticus next time. He'll tell you about it. Right. And I believe that's the point in the lesson, obviously, for us. I don't know that we know any more details than that, Randy. It was an unauthorized, strange, foreign, unauthorized, prohibited, on their own will kind of fire. We got the fire we want. And I think that's all we really know. But while we're talking about these guys, let's make some points. Because everything you read, chapter 28 is another little place you should put an asterisk in the book of Exodus. Because until you get to Exodus chapter 28, there is no officially authorized, formalized priesthood. This is the first time. Now, we read about priests. We read about priestly actions. There is no priesthood prior to this time. That makes it an interesting part of the Mosaic economy of the law. It's an essential component of it. The selection of the priesthood begins in verse 28. Take Aaron, your brother. Now that's interesting because to this point it's always been Moses. Now Aaron's been heavily in concert with him. You take Aaron, a specific person. You take him, your brother, and his sons from among the children of Israel, that they may minister to me, that he may minister to me as priest. Now, most of what we read about in chapter 28 will be the high priest kind of description until we get to the very end. But notice the selection of the priesthood. Now, you recognize within the tabernacle and then later even into the temple, you had three components of workers. You had the Levite, who was responsible for basically the physical manipulations around. You couldn't work in the temple, the grounds, the tabernacle grounds, if you weren't a Levite. But unless you were of the descendancy of Aaron, you couldn't be a priest, one who would perform certain functions, the sacrificial kind of functions, and have the ability to go into the holy place for certain activities. But there was only one high priest who went one time a year into the most holy place. That's it. Until chapter 28 of the book of Exodus, none of that exists. None of it. You want to learn about Jesus Christ, you learn about the priesthood. You want to learn about Jesus Christ, you study the book of oh, what was that? Leviticus. You want to learn about what Jesus does for us today, you study the book of Leviticus. That's where you learn it. Now, why? Select these men. But there is a succession implied. And take, he says, Nadab and Abihu, his two oldest, and the two that we never talk about. How many Bible classes have we taught our children about Eleazar and Ithamar? Shame on us. The only two of his sons that we know are Nadab and Abihu. What happened to Eleazar and Ithamar, the faithful priests? You see, there's just as much powerful lesson in their actions as there are Nadab's and Abihu's. It's worth thinking about. But now there is a separation to be made of these priests, and specifically the high priestly garments. Holy garments, verse 2, shall be made for them. For Aaron your brother, for glory and beauty, for dignity and honor. And I submit to you that has nothing to do with the dignity and honor of Aaron or the priest. It had everything to do with the dignity and the honor of God. It was not to make them look good. It was not to make them look different. It was to suggest something about the God before whose presence they appeared. That is the critical point, I believe, to the garment descriptions. Because that phrase is used twice in this chapter. But let's talk about this garment. Make Aaron's garment, it says, to consecrate him. Verse 3, that he may minister to me as a priest. These are the garments which they shall make: a breastplate, an ephod, a robe, skillfully woven tunic, a turban, and a sash. So they shall make holy garments for Aaron, your brother, and his sons, that he may minister to me as a priest. In other words, he can't minister to me without these garments. He can't minister to me without the tabernacle, and the tabernacle cannot function without him. That's impressive. Make no mistake about it, God can't do what he wants to do for the nation of Israel without the priests. And again, I hope you have about a half dozen New Testament passages ringing off in your ear that remind us as New Testament Christians we are priests. That is our description. Every one of us. The tabernacle was functionless, useless, void, deprived of any power without the priests. And if the priests were not attired according to the pattern of God, they too were inept and ineffective. So many lessons. But now let's draw down on the description. Let's really double down and notice some things that happen. Our attention is drawn to 3 different items in specific. Those 3 items draw our eyes, in our mind's eye, to 3 different parts of the anatomy of the priest. And what I'm going to encourage us to do is look at that as lessons to be learned about what the high priesthood assignment is associated with. And I think ultimately that teaches us more about the Lord that we serve than we might get at first glance by just reading these descriptions of these garments. Let's talk first about the shoulders, verse number 12. You shall put the 2 stones on the shoulders of the ephod as memorial stones for the children of Israel. So Aaron shall bear their names before the Lord on his 2 shoulders as a memorial. The ephod, this apron-like device. It draws our eyes to the shoulders. Now, if I told you that you're bearing the weight of that on your shoulders, what am I implying to you? Responsibility, a burden, a cause, a purpose. And here it is represented by these 2 stones. These 2 stones that had engraved upon them the names of the children of Israel. These 2 onyx stones pressing down upon the shoulders. The weight of responsibility. I am doing something here for God's people. And people who are represented right here. Its coloring was the same as the inner fabric of the tabernacle. It had these 2 onyx stones in verse 9 that had engraved upon them deeply the names of the children of Israel, 6 on each one. I submit to you we learn something about priesthood here. If we think about the shoulders, this makes the priesthood experience a personal experience. The priest wasn't going in there to do a job. He was going in there with the weight of a nation on his shoulders. Do you remember Jesus' prayers in the garden? How he describes the weight? I don't know. This was a personal priesthood. All right, so take our attention now from the shoulders. And now let's look at the breastplate. Verse 29. Aaron shall bear the names of the sons of Israel on the breastplate of judgment over his heart. When he goes into the holy place as a memorial, here's our phrase again, before the Lord. continually. And you shall put in the breastplate of judgment the Urim and the Thummim. They shall be over Aaron's heart when he goes in before the Lord. So Aaron shall bear the judgment of the children of Israel over his heart before the Lord. And he shall do that continually. All right, so the breastplate. The breastplate of judgment. It was a pocket. It was a pocket. It's about 9 inches square when you do the math on it. It was separate from the ephod, but part of it attached by chains at 2 different points. It was attached at the shoulder and it was attached at the waistband. It wasn't going to be jingling around. It wasn't going to be loose. And it contained in these 2 very interesting items. The Urim and the Thummim. You see it used practically if you're interested. Numbers 27 verse 21. When Joshua was making his battle plans and he goes before Ithamar or Eleazar, I believe, for the battle plan. I want to encourage us, instead of getting lost in that discussion of what are these 2 stones, which, depending on who you consult, means either the lights and the darks, or perhaps, according to other people, it means the lights and the perfections. But in either way, it was sort of a divine up or down decision. It was a decision-making item of last resort, always used, at least in my conviction, under the authority of God. But whatever the case was, this ephod had over it this breastplate. And this breastplate, too, had some very interesting items on it. Its coloring, again, is described for us. It has, verse 17, settings of stones in 4 rows, forming 12. And upon each specific stone was written one of the names of the 12 tribes. They made braided cords of pure gold to affix it. Shoulders, again, down to the woven band, so that it does not come loose, verse 28. Now, what are we reading here? I think the breastplate teaches us this. The priestly function is an emotional function. Did you notice how many times the proximity of the stones of memorial of God's people and the stones of judgment of God's rule, His authority, are associated with Aaron's heart? When you go into that holy place to make that sacrifice, you go with knowledge that the people's needs are on your heart. That is emotional. And that you are carrying and acting in accordance with instruction that God has given that human beings need. I'm telling you, that is emotional. This isn't just a casual walk down history path so we can see what people used to dress like. These are the highly symbolic garments that people wore in the very presence of God as they were offering sacrifice. And I tell you, we can learn something here. At least I think we can. So we've gone from the shoulders to the heart. Now, in this mental image that you have of this high priest standing before you, now you've got to change your attention to his feet. To his feet. Verse 31 says, you shall make a robe. The robe of the ephod, olive blue. It goes underneath. It's the outer garment that's underneath the apron. He says, you shall make it of one piece. It has an opening for the head. It fits kind of like an armor. It would fit over top of the head. It has a poncho. But notice the reason for this, because this is kind of intriguing. Verse 32, so that it does not tear. There was a prohibition against tearing these garments. Makes me wonder what Caiaphas was dressed in at the trial of Jesus whenever he tore his clothes. Was he wearing this garment? I don't know. Some people suggest that he was, and if so, that makes what he did a capital crime right there in front of everybody. Now, take it for what it's worth. This garment was not to be torn. But nevertheless, under the hymns, at the end, it was to be coordinated with these alternating pomegranates and bells of gold. Bells. Yeah, just what you think it means. Bells. Why? Verse 35, it shall be upon Aaron when he ministers, and it shall sound. Its sound will be heard when he goes into the holy place, here it is, before the Lord. And when he comes out, that he may not die. This is serious. Yes, he is always to go into that tabernacle, into that function, fully announced. You make no surprise visits on people who are in authority or respected, and it's the same with God. But here's what I want us to think about. Whenever Aaron is perhaps leading in the other priests in a priestly service, or perhaps it's the Day of Atonement when he's going in to make the atoning sacrifice, and he walks in there, what are you hearing? Ching, 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 ching. Every step, ching, 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 ching. What are people thinking? They're getting an audible sound to the movement of a man. For somebody who's lost, to take them to the place where their sins are forgiven. That is transitional. The work of the high priest took someone from a state of sin to a state of forgiveness. Oh, these are interesting. These are interesting. Let's do one more. Let's talk about this turban, but not really the turban. Let's talk about the plate of pure gold that's upon it. Verse 36, we read that it's inscribed, Holiness to the Lord. Holiness to the Lord. You put it on the turban, verse 38 says, So it shall be on Aaron's forehead. Now we're looking at his head. That Aaron may bear the iniquity of the holy things which the children of Israel hallow in all of their holy gifts. And it shall always be on his forehead, that they may be accepted before the Lord. In other words, these people take these sacrifices, they set them apart, they consecrate them for the gift of God or for the sacrifice for their sin. They set them apart. Aaron takes them as the set-apart sacrifice. He makes a sacrifice for them in order that they may be viewed as holy before God. And all of that involves being dressed appropriately on the right time, the right occasion, the right manner, sacrificing these animals. But here's what I want us to think about. What I want us to think about is why upon his forehead? Why on his head? Why on his head is this holiness to the Lord? Well, I believe it's because of this. And I believe it's because he wasn't going in there to kill an animal. And he wasn't going in there to sprinkle blood. That's not why he was going in there. He was going in there to be in the presence of God. His service as a priest was intellectual. He knew. And everybody who saw him going knew, I am going to the Lord. I'm not going to kill an animal. I'm not going into a place to sprinkle some blood upon a device. I'm not going to a place where God is not present. I'm going to him. And there is a lesson there for us. And it happens every Lord's Day or every time we meet for worship. And we get together and we go through an exercise. sacrifice, that is a sacrifice of praise, Hebrews 13. Every time we do that, may I submit to you that upon our heads shall be the idea of holiness to the Lord. All of these, the priestly function, as looked at through the lens of what the priest was wearing, tells us that this was a personal and emotional, intellectual experience that resulted in the transition of people's spiritual states. Oh, and I find that all very exciting. Well, our bell rang. We'll let people come in and out, but anybody have any comments to make, questions, anything? Right. Yeah, I do too, and I think there's particularly the breastplate of righteousness figure, right? A lot of New Testament themes, all of which we learn here, and I think help us in that understanding. It is an interesting point. Others? Thank you so very much.